it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. I used to work as a cook in a barbecue joint, until I saw where the meat was coming from, by Corpse Child. You know, I used to laugh at the idea of being a vegetarian. The idea of purposefully not eating meat used to sound so dumb to me. I mean, yeah, healthy lifestyle and all, and yes, I am aware that some people actually can't eat meat because of an inability to digest it. But come on. How could you say no to a nice full rack of baby back ribs or a quarter-pounder New York-style steak, right? Well, guess the joke's on me now. After what happened, I can't think of any of that without wanting to puke. I'm going to put this out there now. If you're faint of heart or weak of stomach, do not read this. Let me also go ahead and say that no, I'm not talking about Mickey D's either. Say what you want about their food not being actual meat or whatever. I can guarantee you, whatever it is made of, it's far less horrific than what I saw at a place I used to work at. Mr. Pigley's Diner, home of delicious meat, happy bellies, and having a snorting good time. Those words, the big, bold, red words plastered next to that smiling, fat-ass pig with a 50s-style football jacket and haircut, will always haunt my nightmares. The place itself was one of those that was made to resemble an old-timey diner from the 50s and 60s. Black and white tiled floor, vintage photos from car shows, old stuntmen or shots of Elvis Presley, as well as different antiques on display. The place even had an actual jukebox, coin-operated with actual CDs instead of the touch-screen ones you see nowadays. In the middle of the dining area was where the bar was. During the day, till about 6 or so, it was a nice cream bar, with the barley sodas being brought out later on in the evenings. Remember how you could bring your kid up to the bar on a Friday afternoon for a little oinkers hour, where the ice cream was handmade right in front of them, and they got whatever flavor and toppings they wanted, and however much of it they wanted for free. Aside from this, they also had the Piglet Wall of Fame, where the Rugrats would have pictures taken of them in little pig masks with the mascot, Mr. Pigley, standing beside them as they scoffed down a 3-ounce plate of pulled pork. Well, of course, the kids loved it. And the parents loved it too for how dirt cheap the food was. Now we're talking $15 tops for a large-sized barbecue plate with 2 large sides with a drink. I say all of this to say that the place was very family-oriented. Well, particularly when it came to bringing the kids. My family actually used to take me and my brother Andre when we were little kids, and, like I said, with all the other kids, we too had more than our fair share of our little oinker hours on Fridays to kick off the weekend, and had our pictures added to the Wall of Fame, which are all gone now after what happened. Now, take that and fast forward to almost a year ago. I'm 21 and having just moved out of my parents' house with no degree or any other job experience, and I needed to have a way to make rent for my apartment. And you can imagine how difficult a decision it was for me to choose Mr. Pigsley's Diner as my go-to. I was hired almost on the spot, after I put in an application to be a cook. Well, the pay for the job I'd be doing admittedly wasn't quite as bad as I was expecting. $11 an hour, 40 hours a week. Of course, being that it was strictly second shift, this meant long, exhausting nights slaving in the kitchen, and then closing the kitchen. It was rough, but I had to do it. And after about a month or two, I'd just about gotten used to it. Actually, it wasn't long after that I was getting my first raise, to $11.75. I'd also managed to get to a point, usually because the other kitchen staff were out back taking a smoke, that I was actually able to handle working most areas of the kitchen alone. In other words, I'd gotten pretty good at my job pretty quickly. One of my duties, unfortunately, was washing any remaining dishes at night when we closed. It sucked, mostly because of the fact that it was always the grill utensils and shit that I got stuck washing. You know, the shit that would be the dirtiest. And we had to wait until we were closed for the night to wash them. Because of this, and because the shift manager, Trish, usually dragged her feet with her part, making sure everything is done right, as well as the fact that closing shifts only had 2 people around to shut the place down for the night. We weren't usually getting out of there until about 1 or 1:30 in the morning every night. Well, it's because of this that things would take a weird turn. Funny enough, I almost didn't even notice it. It was a Friday night, which of course meant we'd been slammed all day with business, and I was beyond tired and ready to be done with the place for the night. I was in the sink room, located a little ways behind the kitchen and grill area, next to the freezer and dry stock, washing the dishes, as best I could anyway, while Trish finished up with the money. Since my phone was dead, I couldn't listen to music or podcasts while I washed the dishes like I usually did. And that's when I heard it. It was very faint, and again, I almost didn't hear it. It almost sounded like a faint groaning noise. But being exhausted and figuring that it was just the electrical hum of the freezer, I shook it off and continued. It was when I was just about finished with the dishes, though, that I heard it again. Louder this time. Listening a little harder, I noticed that it was indeed coming from the freezer. I pressed my ear to the door, and I could hear it much louder now. Concentrating, I thought I could hear the sounds of muffled sobbing from inside. I tried pulling the handle to open the freezer door, only to find it locked. Weird, I thought. Why is the freezer locked? I was never told before that the freezer was supposed to be locked at night. Maybe it's to keep the meat fresh, keep everything cold. This didn't make much sense to me, but I ended up having to just go with it when I heard Trish calling for me, telling me she was ready to go home. I pretty much immediately forgot all about it until the next night, closing the kitchen when I heard it again. Like last time, the freezer door was locked, and inside I could hear a very faint sound like someone groaning. It was louder this time, a lot louder. I also noticed this time that it seemed like it would randomly let out sharp bursts of crying or wailing. At one point I thought I could hear a shrill sort of screaming noise as well. What the... I started knocking on the freezer door. Hey, hello, hey, is someone in there? Nothing. The only response was the continued groaning noises from the other side. I tried knocking again. Hey, what's going on? I spun around to see Trish standing behind me, looking confused. What the hell are you doing? Have you finished yet? Yeah. I looked at the freezer. Hey, is there any particular reason the freezer's locked? She cocked her eyebrow. What do you mean? I pulled the handle to demonstrate. Her eyes continued looking confused as she then tried to open it herself, with the same result. She said, resigning. That is weird. No, I don't know why the heck they'd have it like this. What's got you so worried about it, though? Well, I thought I could hear something, or somebody in there. What do you mean? She asked, looking even more confused now. I shrugged and chuckled nervously. I don't know, I just kept hearing these weird noises coming from in there. I pressed my ear to the door again, still hearing that faint groaning sound. Hey, do you hear it? Well, still looking skeptical, she then pressed her ear to the door. She stayed like this for a moment before shaking her head. Sounds the same it always has. At least, same as it has since I've been here. Well, this is an old place, though. The wiring in there must be on the fritz. You sure? I asked, cocking my own eyebrows in confusion. Because it sounds like someone's in there. Oh yeah, besides which, we can't get in anyways. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of like to get out of here and go home before it's time to open the place back up. She held up her phone, reading almost 1:45 a.m. With that, I gave one last look at the freezer before turning and following Trish. But that night, I couldn't shrug it off like I'd done before. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop imagining something or someone in the freezer. Moreover, I couldn't stop wondering about what that sound was. Now, obviously, I wasn't buying the whole, just the old 40 wiring crap. What the hell were they doing in there? As it happened, the next day was when the owner, Mr. Pigley, would be in for one of his little routine visits. He'd usually come round once or twice a month, unannounced, and just sort of check in, make sure everyone's doing everything that needs to get done. Basically a sort of general inspection. One thing I noticed too was that one of the first things he always did was to check out the freezer. Naturally, I figured if anything was going on in there, he'd know, right? As well as this, we were actually slow, for the first time that week, by the way, which made it relatively easy for me to ask him about it first thing when he came in. "What do you mean?" he asked me, cocking his eyebrow like Trish did. "Well, the past 2 nights, sir, I've been hearing these weird noises coming from the freezer. Whenever I try to go check it out, though, it's always locked. Is it supposed to be?" He frowned. "What sort of noises?" "I don't really know, sir," I replied, admittedly feeling a bit awkward. "It sounds like someone's in there." And he stared, frowning at me for a moment before opening the freezer and walking inside. I followed him. Inside, of course, I heard the droning of the refrigeration systems. In other words, the normal sounds it should have been making in there. And there were boxes labelled "fresh meat" stacked against the walls. Everything was there just the way it was supposed to be. No weird sounds, nobody else in the freezer, aside from me and Mr. Pigley. "Well," he said, turning back to me, "I don't hear nothing." "Well, He looked back inside for a moment before saying, "Okay, nothing except for the fridge wires on their last legs. I reckon I'll have to get that looked at, won't I?" He chuckled when he said this, before then saying, "Hey, thanks for letting me know." I stood for a moment, confused, before stammering, "Yes, sir, sure thing." I then felt the hand of Andy, one of the other grill hands, tap me on the shoulder, telling me I was needed back in the kitchen. Mr. Pigley waved his hand dismissively before turning and going back into the freezer. Fridge wires on their last legs? I couldn't take my mind off of how wrong that sounded to me. For one thing, the fridge actually sounded normal. Plus, after taking a peek at the thermostat outside, I saw that, well, at least according to the reading at the time, it was working just fine. Secondly, this didn't make sense to me because, if they really were on their last legs, shouldn't he have known that and done something long before now? On top of all that, though, was the fact that the big question wasn't even answered. Why the hell was the freezer door locked? Not only this, how was it locked? There were no bolts or anything on the handle, inside or out. As much as I wanted to shove all of this at Mr. Pigley until I got an answer, I wouldn't get the opportunity again before he left. That night I wasn't the one to close the kitchen, having agreed to switch shifts with Andy so he could get a few more hours in. For some reason he was only scheduled 2 days that week for 5 hours each. So this meant I was getting off that night at around 10 p.m. Because I was still skeptical, or should I say suspicious, about the whole freezer thing, I asked him, as part of the agreement, if he'd keep an eye on the freezer and tell me if he noticed anything off about it. He agreed, though I could tell he thought I was nuts. And so 10 o'clock rolled around, and I was punching the clock, but not before checking the freezer one last time. It was unlocked, and full of nothing but frozen food. I was heading out back to my car when I heard a rustling sound coming from the dumpster. Looking over, I could see the lid pushing up, like something was trying to get out. I was about to brush it off as probably just raccoons or maybe a couple of stray cats, when I heard what sounded like snorting. What the f... And I was cut off when I then heard a high-pitched squealing noise that almost seemed to echo in the empty parking lot. This caused my heart to skip about 3 or 4 beats, and I had to close my eyes and cover my ears tight. This was followed by several loud banging noises coming from inside the dumpster. I watched this continue, jaw slacked, frozen in shock, until the lid of the dumpster suddenly flew open. For a brief moment I saw what looked like 2 pig ears slowly emerge from the dumpster, followed by 2 dark, empty, marble-looking eyes glinting into the streetlights. That was when I took off like a bat out of hell and bolted back around to the front of the diner and ran inside. "Hey, guys," I shouted, crashing through the front doors. He immediately looked at me, wide-eyed and startled. I struggled to speak, being out of breath. There's something out there. Where? Andy asked. I pointed to the back and said, breathless, at the dumpster. His face immediately fell into one that said, "Oh, you're shitting me here, right?" I caught my breath as Trish asked what it was exactly that I'd seen. I began, remembering those two black beady eyes glaring at me. I think it was a pig. A pig? Trish asked, her voice completely bewildered now. Andy stared at me for a second before scoffing. "Dude," he said, sounding like he was 2 seconds from busting his gut, laughing in my face. "Whatever shit you're on." "I'm serious," I shouted, cutting him off. He just kept looking at me like I was crazy while Trish looked lost. I saw 2 pig eyes staring at me from the dumpster. I heard it squealing too. "Where the hell could it have come from?" Trish asked. There's no farm around here." Andy snickered and remarked, "Oh, maybe the last truck had one that wasn't quite ready yet." Oh, Trish snickered at this too. I was the only one, though, who wasn't finding this funny. "Oh, damn it, Andy. I'm not screwing around here. I saw a giant pig staring at me in the dumpster." But he just snickered again. "Ah, it was a giant pig." He then made a surprised face and turned to Trish, saying, "Hear that, Trish? A mean old monster pig is going to get us, eh? Oh!" I curled my hand into a fist, clenching my teeth. I was getting really agitated really quickly. Before I could do or say anything, though, I heard something coming from the back behind the kitchen, near the freezer. "What?" Trish asked, noticing my attention towards the back of the diner. I shushed her before starting towards the freezer. "Listen," I whispered. It sounded like something big was dragging its feet across the floor. "You hear that?" I watched Trish and Andy cup their ears. Listening closer, I could also hear the sound of someone's muffled bawling in the distance, sounding like their mouth was covered or taped over. I watched as Trish seemed to take notice. "What the hell is that?" she asked, turning now to look towards the back like I was. Andy just looked at the both of us, confused. "Now you two, Trish. What are you guys going on?" He stopped when he heard the sound of the freezer door opening. Now his eyes were wide. "What the fuck? Who's back there?" We heard the freezer door shut, still hearing the muffled screaming from behind. Andy started towards the back when I shot out my hand, stopping him. "Wait. What if it's some maniac with a gun or something?" And he just pushed past me towards the back. I followed after him, with Trish joining behind me. The sounds from the freezer were louder now, shrill, like someone was being tortured. I could hear what sounded like a young girl, high school age, screaming, "No, please don't, let me go." These were followed by sharp cries of pain that caused the 3 of us to have to cover our ears. As we were doing this, the sounds, both of screaming and the weird squealing, were getting louder and louder. I began imagining the thing on the other side to be some sort of mutant behemoth pig monster, like Andy had said, with huge muscular arms and gigantic tusks that impaled me like a kebab. Finally, Andy ran and got the emergency fire extinguisher and used it to batter the door until we heard something fall to the ground, crashing on the other side before shoving the door open. In front of the door was a bunch of the fresh meat boxes that had apparently been propped against the door to keep it shut. Now knocked over onto the floor of the freezer, I saw a few of them had broken open, scattering red, meaty, bloody chunks all across the floor of the freezer. Just for a brief second, I looked closely at a pile of the stuff, and that was all it took to make me start to retch. There, spilling out of the box, was what looked to be a large intestine, coiling out from the severed legs of what looked to be a small child, possibly even an infant. Almost on cue, the smell of a dead body flooded my nose instantly, further causing my stomach to turn over on itself. I wasn't the only one struggling to keep from spilling their stomach either, after seeing this. Andy had to cover his mouth and turn away. To her credit, funnily enough, given how she always claimed to hate scary movies in the past when I talked about them, Trish was the only one who wasn't affected by this, at least not as much as me and Andy. She took the lead and went inside. It took another second of pulling ourselves together before me and Andy could follow her, though. Inside, we could all hear the sounds of screaming and pigs squealing from the far end of the freezer. Slowly, the three of us made our way towards the back, towards this sound. Despite what I said earlier about Trish being the most strong-stomached out of the three of us, what she saw next made her vomit right there in the freezer where she stood. There, in the middle of the floor, was a young girl. Couldn't have been a day over 17. Pinned to the floor, naked, and on top of her was a giant, hairy, overweight gorilla of a man, wearing what looked like one of those pig's masks you'd see from Party City on Halloween. The pig man stopped, as he must have heard Trish, and reared up from the girl before turning to look at us. For a second, we all just stood there, me and Trish both speechless with horror, while Andy was the first to speak. "Who are you? What the fuck are you doing?" Whatever, just stood snorting angrily, like he was rearing up to charge at Andy. Trish ran over to try and help the girl, when she was snatched by the throat and hurled into a stack of meat boxes behind her. I ran to help her up, while Andy charged towards the pig man. Just like Trish, Andy was caught by the throat before being forced to the ground. After helping Trish up, she ran over to help the girl, while I tried to help Andy. The pig man had him on the ground, crushing his throat and pressing one knee on his chest, crushing his ribs. And without thinking, I hurled myself at him, shoving him off of Andy and into the wall to the right of us. Andy was wheezing and gasping for air as I helped him to his feet, while Trish rushed her and the girl out of the freezer. "Call the police," I shouted to her as she ran out. When I looked to where the pigman had landed, I saw that the mask had fallen off. Now, against the wall, buck-ass naked, was Mr. Pigley. What the... Before I could even finish that thought, he looked up at me, glaring, before letting out a deafening squeal and charging at me. In less than a few seconds, he was on top of me, ravenously trying to bite at my face like a rabid dog. I tried pushing his face away, which resulted in 3 of my fingers getting bitten, hard enough to start bleeding and go numb. Andy tried wrestling him off of me by getting him in a chokehold, only to be met by a backhand that sent him into the wall again. Now he was crushing my throat like he had been with Andy. My vision started blurring when, the next thing I knew, I felt Mr. Pigley's hand release my throat, causing me to grasp for air. Mr. Pigley was on the ground, staring up at the ceiling, dazed, with Andy holding one of the boxes that he'd used to bash him over the head with. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. Yeah, I groaned, pain still shooting through my hands. I could hear Mr. Pigley groan as he stirred on the floor. I told Andy to stay there and make sure he didn't go anywhere, while I went to check up on Trish. Sure enough, Trish and the girl were out front, talking to a couple of police officers. I joined them and they asked me where he was. I led them back to the freezer where Mr. Pigley was still writhing on the floor. The officers then took over, leading us back out to the front. By that time, the parking lot was filled with police cars and an ambulance. After having them checked out by the ambulance, the other officers escorted Andy, Trish, and the girl home while I was checked out for my hand. I actually had to be taken to the hospital for it to get stitches. I read a few days after that, upon looking into the contents of the freezer, the mutilated remains of infants, as well as several teenagers, had been found with evidence that they were being ground up and processed using the meat grinder next to the dry stock area in the back. Mr. Pigley was arrested and tried for kidnapping, as they were unable to link him to any of the human remains at the time. He claimed, though, that he had absolutely no idea what was going on, that apparently he was at his house one moment and then lying naked in the freezer the next. In the end, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in a psychiatric facility. The diner was closed down and condemned after that, and a month later, it was cleared out and bulldozed. It's now serving as a vacant parking lot. I lost all contact with Trish and Andy, as well as anyone else from Mr. Pigley's diner. Soon after that night, I got a new job as a sales associate at a thrift store, where I work nowadays. Oh, the pay isn't as much and the hours are long, sure, but my co-workers are pretty cool. Plus, at least I don't have to work around food anymore. Well, it was sometime last week that I was scrolling around online, just screwing around on my break at work, when I found old articles about local sightings of the Pigman. I clicked on them and read about multiple reports of people, namely teens and or small children, going missing in the dead of night in the town located just next to mine. Each time a few witnesses would claim to see a giant creature with the head of a pig and the body of a man lurking around. Of course, these were usually the tinfoil hat types making these claims, so it didn't surprise me that these claims weren't exactly taken seriously by authorities at the time. That said, they never found any suspects, nor were the missing persons ever found. But the worst part, the thing that's driven me now to have constant nightmares, was when I looked at the dates of the reports. They were all dated in the early 50s, right around the time that the diner had first opened its doors. All that time, I, as well as God knows how many others, had been eating children. What's even worse is that for almost a year, I was the one that had cooked it and served it to people. This is why I've decided 2 things. First, I will never work in another food establishment again. No exceptions. And the second is that I'm strictly a vegetarian. It was admittedly a bit hard at first. Like I said, how could you pass up a nice juicy prime rib? But any time I thought about meat of any kind, well, I can't help but remember what I saw in the freezer that night. I am what many would perceive as the luckiest man on earth. Well, maybe saying something such as this is a tad hyperbolic, but, well, I'm no jackpot winner, but I do have my fair share of blessings. So let's contextualize just how fortunate I've been over the years, shall we? I say we start at the beginning. Like the very beginning. Here we're going back a long way for this. When it comes to my mother, it's very easy to say that she had no redeeming qualities in any way, shape, or form. While carrying me in the womb, her top priority was not me, but rather drinking and consuming a rather large quantity of drugs. She lived a nomadic lifestyle which could be explained by her constant financial struggles. I suppose chasing one's desires and allowing temptation to be that which governs life is more appealing to some than creating a safe environment for a future family. What I'm getting at here is that I survived despite the many, many chances that I wouldn't. When I ask myself how favoured I've been throughout my life, my birth is, of course, the first thing that comes to mind. Well, things don't stop there, however, because of several complications that would present themselves in the future. For one, I had severe asthma throughout my childhood. I frequently reminisce of the plentiful times where I had to carry a machine with me to breathe. I often had to miss many days of school due to my excessively weak immune system. I was very prone to disease, and when I became sick, it would take me far longer than average to recover. Well, life progressed, as did I. Although my health had increased, I can't say the same for my intelligence. Yeah, that's a knock on myself, but I can't call it unjustified, considering the number of times I risked my life without even recognizing it. From poking a fork into an electric socket to tying a fishing line around my wrists tightly, I certainly wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. Well, I would assume that by now the point has been made about my blessings. It's a strange thing to look back on, the memories I have of my thoughts and feelings of those times. They all juxtapose my current situation. Having the cold metal barrel of a gun against my temple sends shivers down my spine. I feel so overwhelmed by the sentimentality and stress I feel coursing through my veins. The past and present collide together, sparking a fire within my head. My fingers claw through my tangled hair and my lip quivers nearly as fast as my intensely beating heart throbbing in my chest. I need to swallow the lump in my throat and collect myself. I need to breathe deeply. I need to wipe the tears from my eyes and the sweat from my brow. Look, all this thinking isn't for nothing. It's not like I'm invulnerable. I've been cut and bruised and bombarded by the ones I love. I'm no stranger to feeling vulnerable and damaged. The only question which resides within my mind now is this. Why me? It is my hope that this note will provide you, and perhaps myself, with the answer to the madness which has engulfed my life. The memory of the night it happened is hard to remember for me. I recall stumbling out of the pub as the moonlight illuminated the parking lot. I shouldn't have started the damn car. Even I could smell my horrendously intoxicated breath as I shut the door behind me. I sloppily adjusted the window mirror, its smooth, gleaming surface giving me a glimpse of myself. The dark rings around my eyes and the glossy scarlet colouring of my sclera were very telling of my state at that time. Yet, with the turn of a key, my ignition roared, and off I drove into the night. I couldn't tell you how long I rode along the rural road that evening. The glimmering stars in the sky turned to a blur as my vision and my hearing turned fuzzy. The landscape was desolate, aside from the trees which swiftly passed me by. Strange, isn't it? How rapidly a situation can completely devolve into something horrid. One second I was travelling alone in a secluded area, and a blaring horn and a brilliant light flooded my ears, and then the next, after that, nothing. I don't remember the impact, only the darkness which quickly enveloped me. Upon regaining consciousness, the first thing I noticed was the crimson blood that smeared my steering wheel. My hands clenched the door handle tightly. With all my might, I pushed the door open and crawled out of the vehicle. My palms pressed against my head and my knees were shuddering. I ogled the scene displayed before my eyes. Compared to the damage done to the other car and its driver, my suffering was nothing at all. The small van that I collided with was bent inwards in the front, its windshield completely shattered. I stumbled my way over to the passenger side and peered inside the window. Within the car sat a young woman, her head leaned back in her seat. Her mouth sat slightly open, and her wide-open eyes were glossy and rolled back, devoid of life. Glass shards pierced her body, soaking her clothes in the blood that leaked from her wounds. Her nose had been smashed and pushed back into her skull. Chunks of flesh that had once been on her face now remained on the leather steering wheel. Sickly yellow vomit erupted from my throat and splashed onto the road. My stomach would empty itself for several minutes, each heave and lurch taking the oxygen from my lungs and bringing about a stream of hot tears. They dropped onto the pavement along with my insides, and this kept up until all that remained within my gut was air. My head pulsated from the pain that I felt, as if a mallet was being bashed into my cranium non-stop. Whether this was brought about by what was left of my hangover or the grotesque scene before me, I do not know. I reached into my pocket for my phone. I tried to turn it on, but it was dead, and I knew that the road that I was on was so dormant that it might take the rest of the day for help to arrive. Clenching my jaw tightly shut, I turned back to the vehicle before me, eyes darting around to avoid seeing the corpse once more. I could see a phone on the floor by the passenger side of the car. Walking to the other side of the car, I curled my sweat-drenched fingers into a fist and began to pound on the window. After a few strikes, I broke through the glass and was able to reach the phone. When the police arrived, the alcohol was pretty much out of my system. While the accident was my fault based on circumstantial evidence, the charges I faced were nowhere near close to how bad they should have been. I, of course, sent my best wishes to the girl's family, but it wasn't enough. No amount of retribution could ever mend the hearts of the people my actions had wounded. I didn't attend her funeral. In fact, I couldn't even bring myself to ask the family if I could have. How could I face those who surely despised me with every ounce of their being? Such a thing is implausible, to say the least. And so, what did I do? I tried to let such memories fade into obscurity. A fruitless trial, of course, but my cowardice and inability to face what I'd done and who it had affected plagues me in every waking moment of every day. I should have done better. I wish I'd done better. And yet, I didn't. And it's too late to change that. As I write this, I look down at my right arm. The scars and bruises I received from breaking that window cover the surface of it. They exist as physical reminders of the deep emotional cuts that still haven't healed. The gun still sits beside me on the desk, and I can't help my straying eyes wandering over to it. The thought of using it on myself is tempting, but I shouldn't. Not yet, anyway. You see, I don't wish to end my life because of the accident, or any specific actions I've done at all, for that matter. There's something else. Something more compels me to try and take my life. So please, allow me to further explain my predicament. Fast forward a few years. I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. I gripped the doorknob and swallowed the saliva which coated my throat. I'd thought that maybe I'd simply forgotten to lock the house up before I'd left earlier. After conjuring up comforting explanations in my head, I gently pushed the door ajar and placed one foot inside my home. As soon as I entered the living room, my jaw practically dropped to the floor. Everything was in disarray, from paper spread across the floor to chairs moved and knocked over. I took a few steps forward, slowly treading further into the room. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. One of the footsteps that landed on the polished oak floor didn't line up with my own. Another step was taken. It wasn't mine. When the blade entered my back, it shredded through my tissue and went down to the bone. My jaw catapulted open, and a shriek akin to that of a banshee escaped my mouth. I collapsed to the floor, hitting my head against the table leg. I looked up at my assailant, and he stared into my eyes. In front of me was the visage of a man with pure hatred stitched into his expression. His pupils had dilated beyond what I thought was humanly possible. He charged me and knelt on my stomach, burying the blade deep within my chest with one swift motion. My head threw back and I screamed bloody murder. Desperately reached my hand up and clawed at the man's face, and in retaliation he repeatedly slammed my body against the floor. At that moment I thought it was over, that my life would come to a violent end. I could no longer feel the pain then as I had prior. I felt numb, and all I could do was look into those maddening eyes. I would die a life of mediocrity and regret, where the remembrance of my time on this earth would be deliberately forgotten as the steady marching of time continued. My eyes closed as the depressing thought of my end consumed me. Suddenly I heard a sickening crack. The fingers that had once held such a strong grip on me faltered, and soon I'd been released. Reality rushed back to me, and I pushed myself away from the man who was now sprawled across the floor, a grimace stitched into his face. A large pot had fallen from the top shelf of my cabinet and onto his head, causing him to bleed profusely from his scalp. His knees shook as he tried to find his balance. The agony I'd felt resurged, and I held my tongue firmly to stifle my cries. Now back on his feet, the man methodically made his way towards me, swaying from side to side and extending his arms in my direction. I was confronted by a myriad of possibilities at that moment, as a surge of questions came to me all at once. What would he do to me? How could I stop him? Do I have a chance of survival? A disgusting sloshing sound produced by the man walking through the pool of blood that sat where I once was caught my attention. He instantly accelerated towards me, but in his quick burst of speed he slid on the slippery surface and missed his target. His body fell into the wall and the force repelled him back, crashing to the ground. A fresh puddle of gore emerged where he fell. His neck had landed on the spot where the knife lay, and the serrated edge had gashed his throat. I made my way towards him, took off my shirt, attempting to create some sort of bandage for him. I knew he had tried to kill me, but despite that, and my serious injuries, I tried my best to save the man's life. I didn't want to deal with yet another cold carcass in my sight. I looked into his eyes once more, and the anger that I'd previously seen in them had been replaced with sadness. His blood was oozing through my shirt and trickling onto my hands, and the color was draining from his face. With every breath he took, his chest rose less, until the movement was hardly noticeable at all. He raised his hand to my collar and softly gripped it, expending almost all his energy in the process. His lips parted, and he spoke to me, his voice faint and dry. "Why couldn't you have just stayed off the road, asshole?" His voice trailed off and his eyes closed. I couldn't react to what he'd said, nor could I move a single muscle. The lifeless body in my living room fell from my arms as I stared into the void, my mouth agape. Memories of that fateful night flooded back to me once more, and my entire body shook with such a ferocity that I had not imagined possible. My nose felt clogged, my lungs congested, a gasp for oxygen that my body had begun to deprive me of. I felt as light as a feather, yet the weight in my chest carried the burden of an anvil. As sudden as my descent into panic had begun, it ended. Pressure faded away and I collapsed to the floor, bloody and bruised. With all the might I could foster, I grappled for my telephone and called for help. Many hours and stitches later, my doctor entered the room where I was resting. He approached me, a smile plastered on his face. "You're a very lucky man, you know. The stab wounds you sustained were bad, but nothing fatal. If the blade had entered your body only a few inches further in either direction, you wouldn't be here today. It's very fortunate that you're alive." "Yeah, just my luck," I responded. I didn't care to say anything else, for the man's final words were all I could think of. Looking back on these moments, I lifted my shirt and grazed my fingers along the scar along my back. The texture is different from the rest of my body. Another injury, another reminder of why I'm making this note. Even still, I need to face these thoughts and finish this writing. It's odd how different our perspectives will be upon reading this text in the future. I think, after many months of retrospect and research, that what you may find as a suicide note is, to me, a text which serves to record my life so that I may look back on it, if my theory about my good fortune is to be true. My life both draws near to its end, and yet it will only continue from here. I suspect this is not the first time such a thing has occurred. It is, however, the first time I shall document it. Now that sounds contradictory, I know, but something tells me that I might not be too far off the mark. I can feel the pain swelling within me, and not just in the form of emotional torment. I feel physically ill. My ribs are visible through my rough, leathery skin, and my arms have grown weary just from this minute amount of writing. I sleep 12 hours a day on average, and that doesn't include the various naps I take throughout the afternoon. I need to finish this quickly, so I think it's time I write candidly to you about my latest plight, and the reason why I ultimately believe I need to go through with my suicide. Well, I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. When the news was revealed to me, I didn't know how to feel. I thought I could make it through this. Well, I've always made it, haven't I? No matter the odds, luck was always in my favor. This offered me little comfort once the pain began to gradually increase. My will to eat, to drink, and to work was greatly diminished. I took off from work, of course, because, well, what's the point? Most people would use this opportunity to spend as much time with their loved ones as possible. They would make a bucket list of everything they'd ever wanted to do and fulfill those goals. Well, that was my impression of what one did when they knew they had limited time on this earth, anyway. I suppose my expectations were wrong. I don't currently do any of those things because all I can do is sleep. I rest and eat a small portion every day and spend the rest of my time watching television. I don't waste away and expect pity out of it. I don't need any condolences because, although my life has had plenty of pain that I brought onto myself, dying with regrets is not what I am afraid of. I sit in my chair, my fingers spread across my keyboard. I cup my hands and breathe into them, and then move them to my nose and take in the stench of my stale breath. I haven't brushed my teeth in weeks. My shower has remained dormant for just as long. Motivation is lacking. Morale is low. And yet I type and type, detailing my experiences for all to see. My eyes dart across the room to the clock. It's later than I usually stay up, but this is important. What can I say? I have a message that needs delivering. I don't think my plight is solely my own. My luck is beyond that which any man, woman, or child could ever experience in this world, but I don't think that's a coincidence at all. My mind is beginning to race again. All the people I initially met. Everyone I've spoken to and everyone that I've seen. I am dead to all of them, and in a way they are dead to me. How can I wrap my head around all of this? It's just my luck to have survived through situations where I should have died, right? I should have been a cold corpse 6 feet under by now, and yet here I am. The most blessed man on earth. My body aches, as does my heart. I hold my withered hand up to my head and rest my elbow on the flat surface that I sit before. The lights have faded, and all that illuminates me now is the computer screen. What's the point of living anymore? Am I here to rot and forever be haunted by my past? There's no rhyme or reason at all. No purpose for all these happenings. It's as if the world is doing what it can to keep me alive. 3 months. That's how long it's been since I was supposed to die. I've been told it can happen any day now, yet somehow I doubt that. Such a thing would be a miracle at this point. I can see my gun reflected on my computer screen. It's getting harder to resist thinking about it. Those who read this might feel that these are the final words of someone with more than a few screws loose, but I feel like I have some sort of obligation to warn you that I don't think I'm alone in this experience. There's nothing extraordinary about me. Perhaps this is something that everyone will experience, the ability to survive against impossible odds. No human could go through the things I've been through and live to tell about it. I don't think our minds can comprehend everything that we experience. Think about how many times you've had a near-death experience. Is it reasonable to presume that we've all just been so fortunate as to endure beyond what anyone could? Or is there something more? As I've discovered, some refer to these phenomena as the quantum immortality thought experiment. The notion that since our brain cannot comprehend what comes after death, our mind is instead transferred into another universe where our deaths simply never occurred. Yeah, I know it's only a thought experiment, but could this be what's happening with me? Everything that has happened can't just be luck, can it? Is the universe keeping me alive and hiding the truth from me? Is it doing the same for all of us? I clench the weapon within my hand once more. My finger is lightly placed on the trigger. I think I'm almost ready now. For all my speculation as to how and why, in truth I don't know that my suspicions are correct. I need to test this theory to reveal what's truly going on. This is perhaps the end of the line for us, dear reader. For me, it may not be. Well, if I'm correct, then the same can be said of you. God, I wish I could dispel my fortune. What is there to live for except the melancholic prospect of suffering in one's pity and pain when there are no consequences for one's actions? No ultimate ending, no finale to the story of our lives. It's now time for me to part with you. Remember the different perspectives we shall have regarding this documentation. I truly don't know if I'm right about this. Maybe I'm completely wrong, and this is the end for me. Maybe I really was just the most fortunate man in the world. Whatever the case, this is something I need to do, if for no other purpose than to discover the truth about my life and our reality. Well then, let's test my luck one last time. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Hayes. I'm a psychotherapist who specializes in the unlocking of repressed memories. A repressed memory, for those of you who may not know, is a rare psychological phenomenon in which memories or traumatic events may be stored in the unconscious mind and blocked from normal conscious recall. In simple terms, the human mind can sometimes hide away memories of trauma or abuse, giving them the illusion as if the event had never happened. Some theorists claim this is a defense mechanism developed in the cases of young children who could probably not be able to mentally cope with the trauma from the experience. At first glance, this may not seem to be much of a concern. What you can't remember can't hurt you, right? Well, for some people this may be the case, but in others they find themselves responding to mental triggers, smells, sounds, or phrases with no prior knowledge as to why they're having these experiences. For others, they may unknowingly stumble across the memory in their sleep. Have you ever had a dream that seemed so vivid and real, yet upon awakening, you think back to it, unable to recall when in your life the scenario happened? What you simply dismissed as a strange dream could have very well been a repressed memory unwittingly stumbled upon in your subconscious. It's weird, I know, but please, bear with me. I find the phenomenon fascinating, which is why I chose to specialize in this area of psychology in my studies and practices. Periodically, from time to time, I'm visited by patients from all over the country who believe they have experienced this phenomenon. After being referred to me by their therapist, who suspects their patients may have repressed memories from their childhood, it's then up to me to unlock these memories. Only after using social cues and making notes on their reactions to certain smells, sounds, and pictures can I estimate where in their lifetime the repressed memory takes place. This is a slow process that can take up to a year before we even identify the time frame of this memory. Once the right time frame of the repressed memory is discovered, commonly between the ages of 4 to 12, I bring in what I call the dream screen. a device invented by the National Center for Neural Applications, lent to me by the University of Illinois. The appropriately nicknamed Dream Screen is a device that measures brain activity while you sleep. This data can be plugged into an algorithm that reconstructs your memory so that it can be played back in a recording. Subjects are first put into a stage of sleep called hyponagogia. This is a semi-lucid stage of sleep that takes place at the moment between sleep and wakefulness, so that I can communicate with them as I watch their memory unfold on the screen, live, as if I myself were the living memory. While walking the subject through the memory for the first time, it's up to me to coax the subject through the entire memory, asking the right questions, pointing out the hidden details, all while making a conscious effort into not leading the subject too much as to incidentally plant false memories into their subconscious. This is an incredibly delicate procedure and requires absolute concentration on my behalf, something I've only been able to achieve after years of experience and practice. This entire process can take up to an entire month to complete, but the results are always worth it. Some patients were able to recover memories they lost years ago and finally be able to come to terms with the past and put years of not knowing to rest. Other times, missing evidence from crimes and horrific injustices such as rape, torture, and child abuse were able to be reported in a court of law so that the victim could finally get the justice they deserve. It is for moments like these that I continue to do what I do. It was only after viewing my most recent subject's results that I ended up having more questions than answers. Questions I'd never imagine asking myself. Questions, in hindsight, even I would much rather be left unanswered. The subject, Hugo, was a 26-year-old male from Eden, New York. He was initially referred to me by his family therapist after identifying gaps in his memories and recalling a strange, reoccurring dream he had no memories of in his childhood. The subject appeared healthy, both mentally and physically. Aside from the obvious signs of sleep deprivation, he was in great shape for someone his age. During our initial interviews, he was able to recall memories from as far back as 1995, when the subject was only 2 years old. These memories were recorded and replayed to his living relatives and confirmed as being legit. This is very impressive and gave me high hopes for this being a quick and easy case. All there was left to do was find the key. I asked the subject if he could recall any forms of abuse during his childhood years, either from the hands of a family member, a friend, or a stranger. No, nothing like that, he replied with a forced smile on his face. Do you ever recall witnessing a traumatic event such as a traumatic accident or a murder take place? I asked him curiously. No, nothing. As long as watching reality TV doesn't count, he remarked comically. I forced a smile at the bad joke and continued. Tell me about those dreams you've been having, I asked him with genuine curiosity. His smile was quickly replaced by a look of concern as he unconsciously stole a glance over his shoulder and then back to me. Well, he stuttered. It started happening last year, he said as he took a casual sip of water from his table and continued. I noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he placed the glass back onto the table. I've been having this dream. I'm in a field at the old family farm. How do you know it was that particular location? I asked. According to your file, you moved several times during your childhood. I'd recognize those blue skies and open farmland anywhere, he said. My mother would complain all the time about wanting to move back to the city, but my father claimed that the open country air would do us kids some good. What else do you remember? I asked patiently. I remember standing in an open field, walking towards something. Go on, I coaxed him. He sat there for a moment in silence, becoming visibly tense. Then, Well, things get weird, he said nervously. I'm all of a sudden in a dark room I've never seen before, and someone else is there. Do you remember who this person is? I asked him. No, I don't, he said. Well, if I could be 100% honest, I don't remember anything else that happened. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as if trying hard to remember. How old were you when you lived on that family farm? I asked him. 9 to 10 years old, he replied, more confidently. I lived with my grandparents at the time. It was only only for about a year or so. Anything else you can remember about your time there that you think could be related to this dream? I asked. I don't know, the patient admitted. Yeah, that's where my memory begins to get a little foggy. All I know is that hours, even days after having the dream, I just can't shake this feeling of dread. No matter how much I tried, I just can't calm my nerves after that dream. I took a few notes and stood to my feet. Well, I guess the only way we're going to find out is through phase 2. I moved the cart over to where the patient was sitting and began to prep the dream screen. After leaning the subject's seat back into a prone position, I administered the sedative to ease him into his semi-lucid state. After placing the electrodes to his temple and forehead, I slipped on a pair of headphones to the patient so that I could communicate with him from the observation room. After guiding the patient through verbal cues and building the scenario, I began to see the first sign of images on the screen. The memory started dark at first, but what began to look like an open wheat field came into view. I began to take in the sights. Blue skies, white clouds, the sway of the golden wheat blowing in the wind, and what appeared to be a small country home in the distance. Okay, now tell me, where are you standing right now? I asked the subject. The farm, the subject mumbled. Yeah, the one I grew up on. As he spoke, I took in the surroundings as they began to become clearer as the subject began to remember. Now, tell me who else was with you, I prodded. My friend, no, my cousin, Katie, the subject said. Good, you're doing great, I said encouragingly as a figure appeared walking next to the subject in his memory. Now describe your cousin. What did she look like? Dirty blonde hair, brown eyes, freckles on her nose, the subject said confidently as Katie came into view, exactly how he described her. She looked to be around 8 years old. Come on, Huey, Kate said excitedly. Can you see it? The old farmhouse. Look, we're almost there. Can you tell me about this farmhouse? I asked the subject. Yeah, it was an old abandoned house built on my grandfather's property. It was built before my family bought the property. We just lived a few acres away from it, he mumbled quietly. Well, Kate and I wanted to check it out. We were planning on making it a new clubhouse. I spotted a small smile on the subject's face from the window of the observation room as he began to remember. We had a backpack full of stuff. Action figures, comic books, a couple of Snickers bars, he said quietly. We were driven out of our old clubhouse in the hayloft after a family of raccoons moved in. Now, describe the old farmhouse to me, I asked him as the blurry image of the house began to come into contrast. 2 stories, peeling dark blue paint, thatch roof, old tire swinging tree out front, he told me. The image now became clear as the farmhouse came fully into view, down to every detail he described it in. Come on, Huey, Kate beckoned. Let's see what's inside. As she walked to the front door, the subject's eyes darted to a window on the top floor. The figure quickly moved out of view that appeared to be watching them. Wait, I blurted. Who was that? The subject's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. I don't remember, he said after a long pause. I let it go and then let the subject continue. Okay now, what happened to you after you went inside of the farmhouse? What did you find inside? I asked. Nothing, the subject said slowly. It was cleaned out. No people, no furniture, not even a single scrap of litter. The dream suddenly grew darker as the subject now appeared in a small, dimly lit room. Light pooled out from the creases in between the boarded-up windows. Oh, isn't this great? Kate said excitedly. Oh, we can have campouts. We can have picnics. We can even invite our friends over. Her voice was cut off as a low creak sounded from upstairs. What? What was that? Kate said nervously. It's probably another family of raccoons, I heard Kate say as the subject's eyes trailed to the top of the stairs. Oh, wait. I remember now, the subject said shakily. Who was it? I asked cautiously. No, not who, the subject said with genuine fear in his voice. Oh God, it was a... His voice trailed off as a figure appeared from the top of the stairs. I leaned in close, trying my best to make out the figure standing there. Stay with me, I coaxed the subject. Describe what you saw inside of that farmhouse. The subject didn't say anything. His facial features remained taut, but his lips quivered. My eyes went back to the screen as the humanoid figure began to walk down the stairs. Huey? Kate's voice said softly and nervously. Who is... The figure suddenly dropped onto all fours and dashed down the stairs with alarming speed. Teeth, the subject shouted. Odd, white eyes, pale skin. The figure suddenly stopped, inches away from the subject's face. My heart began to race as the image cleared up, as the subject began to remember. Most of what I could make out of the face of the figure was only what was visible in the small slivers of light from the boarded-up windows. Pale skin, gleaming white teeth, and brown receded gums from a mouth whose lips were pulled so far back they almost appeared to not exist. Its eyes were also rolled so far back that the pupils and irises were not even visible, showing only the whites of its eyes. Its nose was nothing but two slits, as it breathed heavily only inches away from the little boy's face. The being wore no clothes and appeared to be human, yet showed no discernible signs of gender. For a long time, I watched in complete shock as the figure appeared unmoving, the slits where the nose should have been flaring with every breath. Its teeth began to click as if in curiosity as a movement was spotted from behind the being. Oh, Katie, no, the subject screamed in unison with the child in the dream. Kate stood behind the figure and swung a 2x4 at the being's head. The creature spun around with lightning speed, catching the little girl's wrist in his hands and lashed out with the other, slicing a clean cut into the child's stomach with its clawed hand. Kate fell onto her back, hands covering the open wound, and began to whimper terrified, subdued sobs as the creature slowly crawled on top of her, its face now inches from hers. Leave her alone, the subject screamed once again in unison with his younger self as he made his way forward, arms outstretched as if to push the creature off his cousin. The creature once again moved with blinding speed, knocking the boy across the room with a mule kick to land roughly against the opposite wall. The creature once again drew its attention back to the young girl lying beneath it. It slowly leaned forward, its mouth only inches away from the young girl's ear. It then stopped, and a hissing whisper could be heard from the creature's mouth. Kate looked up in confusion as the creature then broke into a sprint, dashing out the open door faster than any living creature I've ever seen move in my entire life. The screen went dark as an alarm went off in the observation room. The subject began to shake violently, as if in a seizure. I ran forward, quickly shut down the machine, and removed the electrodes from the subject's head. "Katie, no, leave her alone," the subject cried as the trashing became less violent and he slowly drifted into unconsciousness. I'll be honest with you. This was not the first time I'd seen this creature while using the dream screen. The first time I dismissed it as simply a pseudo-memory. Sometimes the subject's subconscious would replace the person who caused the trauma with a childhood fear, like the monster in their closet, or a creature from a horror movie that scared them as a kid, creating a pseudo-memory. But the second time I saw it, I knew it was so much more than that. Several times before I've seen this thing locked deep into a subject's locked memories, as if its appearance itself was so horrifying that the human brain automatically retracted the memory into the deepest parts of the subject's memories as to keep them from going insane. Each subject completely different, unrelated, with no discernible trends or patterns in physical appearance, mental health or age. I do not know who or what this thing is, but I have dedicated my entire career to finding out what it is. Every case only leads to dead ends, but this case was different. Never in any of my past subjects' memories have I heard this creature speak. Even in my most recent reports, I could not make out exactly what was said. Earlier this month, I contacted the most recent subject's cousin from this memory, Kate. After much convincing on my behalf, I talked her into visiting my office in Washington, D.C. to have her memories examined. The now fully grown Kate was also experiencing similar dreams as the most previous subject prior to our first meeting. Her resulting memory, once unlocked, ran parallel to that of her cousin's. She also bore an old scar on her stomach in the same place the creature had scratched her in the memory, proving its legitimacy. The only difference between that of Kate's memory was the creature's voice was now clear as day. I will never forget the words I heard from Kate's memory. The sound of the creature's hissing voice still fresh in my mind. What I heard it say to that little girl almost 17 years ago. "Stop searching for me, Dr. Hayes." Yeah, 3 delightfully evil stories for you there, told in the pouring rain. I don't do the rain sound effects too often, but I do kind of enjoy it, and sometimes you just think, well, this story or these stories in particular, they work in this kind of environment. So yeah, that's kind of why I did that this evening. Yeah, so I haven't done a compilation like this for a while either. I really enjoyed doing shorter stories sometimes. Not always need to be the long form ones. I know you like them, but sometimes, and there's just so many good things going up on the subreddit as well. So just want to make sure I do enough of the good ones. That's it for this evening. Back again very soon. Till the next time, my dear friends. Very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.